Good morning. Today is Tuesday, July 21st. On June 16th in 1965, the clouds were heavy with moisture coming up from the south. The weatherman said that there's a river of water above us. In my hometown of Castle Rock, Colorado, the ground was already saturated from unusually heavy rain that spring. And now it seems as though the Gulf of Mexico was being carried aloft and was crashing into the mountains. And so it rained. On that day, that afternoon, it rained 12 inches in 3 hours. Upstream, a little ways from us, it was 14 inches during those 3 hours. Plum Creek, this little brook that ran through the middle of our town, was usually something that you could just step over. But on that day, it grew to be a quarter-mile wide. The bridges on I-25 were 40 feet above the creek, but on that day, they were overrun and wiped out. The big steel I-beams that held the bridge in place upon which the traffic would flow, those big I-beams were twisted like paper clips and buried in the sand. Homes were swept away. Farms were wiped clean. And my friend Jim lost his mother. Her body was found 3 days later up in the branches of a tree. It was a sad event. For weeks we watched I-25 being rebuilt. Not just the bridges, but the road itself had been washed away. Homes and businesses had to be rebuilt. And then there was the smell of the flood that hung over our little town. They called that a 100-year flood because it seems that there is a cycle in nature that occurs about every 100 years that brings about a catastrophic event like this in lots of different places. Well, it's been 55 years since that date, and so the clock is ticking, waiting. Someday, another flood will come. But it's not just in the area of flood that we see 100-year events. In the time frame of 1918 to 1920, the Spanish flu was a pandemic that swept the world. In 1820, it was the bubonic plague. In 1720, it was again the bubonic plague. And there have been other events, other pandemics, seemingly almost scheduled, but not really so, but on somewhat of a cycle. Cholera, smallpox, other terrible diseases. About every 100 years, with a few pandemics thrown in besides that, we see this kind of event take place. The point of this is simply that catastrophes happen. And they seem to almost happen on some kind of a cycle, which we don't understand at all. But what we are facing today, we certainly face with much more hope. Today, our medical science is much more advanced than earlier times could have ever dreamed. And they got through their pandemic, and thus we will get through ours as well. The day will come that we'll be through with the masks and through with the social isolation, and we'll get back to having, at least in that section of life, some kind of normality. But then, along with this, just to make things interesting, we also have riots in the streets of our major cities. We have terrible racial strife. We have a political division so severe in our nation right now that the nation itself is badly divided. It's a very ugly event right now. We live in terrible times. And the coming election is not going to solve any of this. After November, we're still going to be a divided nation, because the nature of this division is based not just on a cycle of an election, but it's based on human unreasonableness and hate. And so there's some things that have to be fixed. So what are we to do about this? Well, right now, it's very obvious that we need some leadership that can lead us out of this mess that we're in. But the truth is that none of us sees any leadership coming from the political powers that will solve this. It's just not happening. You may be convinced that your political side really has answers, but there's too many things right now that don't seem to have answers. And if those sides really had the answer, we'd be seeing the results. The leadership is not coming from politics. So, again, I ask, what are we to do? Well, let's step back and we assess our situation. We figure out what we have and what we don't have and what we need to do right now. Here is our situation. We live in a time of a pandemic. We live with racial division. We live with political hate. And we live in a time when basic morality has been rejected. Things that we used to all agree were wrong are now being accepted not only as normal, but they're even being celebrated. All of this sounds pretty depressing, except for one other reality. One other factor we can still enter into this equation. The thing that helps us in our situation. The reality is that God is still there. We have hope because we trust in Jesus Christ. Certainly most of the people that are listening to this attach themselves to the idea of following Jesus Christ. And He is our hope. He is our strength. And so we lean on Him right now. And we look back, and throughout history, nations have found themselves in situations that also seemed hopeless and unmanageable. But God is still God. Christ is still Lord. And we are the people of our time to meet the challenges of our time. The great leadership that is needed right now, it's going to have to arise from the people who seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. God does not call us to do more than we can do. And He does not leave us alone in times of trouble. He does demand that we acknowledge Him and His righteousness. And with these demands, He gives strength to overcome. Christians, right now is not a time, in spite of all the chaos, right now is not a time for us to cower in the corner. It is a time for us to rise up and to meet the injustice and the unreasonableness of the world that is around us. None of us knows exactly where all this trouble is leading, but we do know that our Almighty God is still in control and waiting on His people to shine His light into this dark, dark world. What an honor He has given us to be His people at this time.